I'm going to start talking about, give a picture about what happened a year ago. The U.S. was in as of course the world was in, a deep economic crisis. The financial system was out of control. The election of Barack Obama, the first African American to be elected to that office of president in a country built on slavery, in that context, attracted tremendous hope. Not just hope, but euphoria. And this was not, as some it might be tempting now to look back cynically and say, well, it was all rebranding. Nothing was different about Obama. The election, in hindsight, was not so significant. I don't think so. If you want to understand what was invested in the Obama election victory by the tens of millions of people who voted for him, a couple of facts will help get that across. Between just 2003 and 2005, the Bush years, $400 billion in pre-tax dollars were shifted from the bottom 95% of the population to the richest 5%. Tremendous shift in wealth. And this was during an economic expansion in which family income was less at the end of the expansion than at its beginning. Even during the economic growth that we had, inequality was increasing, social problems were being magnified, people were more and more living on credit, relying on borrowing money against their house to try to maintain their standard of living. All that began to collapse at the end of 2007. Obama, in his campaign, tapped into a widespread feeling for change. In his campaign, he said, we are the change we've been waiting for. He alluded to the civil rights movement, the sit-down strikes of the 1930s, the struggle of women for the right to vote. And he said, in his acceptance speech, help is on the way. Under the Republicans, you're on your own. Vote for me, help will be on the way. And we know now that help was on the way, but it was on the way to Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and Citigroup and all the other financial institutions and companies that benefited from a tremendous bailout. People have heard the figure of $700 billion given to financial institutions and other companies. But in fact, the amount of money that the U.S. government has either invested, loaned, or guaranteed to capital totals about $13 trillion, which is nearly the entire economic output of the United States. Help was on the way for finance capital and for capital generally. And, workers voted for Obama thinking he would be a vehicle for change, that labor law would be more favorable, that healthcare reform would come about, that a basic sense of fairness would return to society after the smash and grab years of George W. Bush. But in fact, what's happened is Obama was seen by capital as a shield against that change. As a shield against that change, a substitute for real change, right, at the ballot box. So that's why Wall Street and the hedge funds backed him. My comrades and I in the International Socialist Organization believe that the change was possible, raised expectations, could pave the way for activism, but would really depend on the activism, on the struggle. Now, I'll talk more about that in a minute. But just to talk about the reality, the social reality today, so that you have some sense of it. We have officially 10% unemployment. If you include everyone who's working part-time but would like a full-time job, it's 17%. If you include all the workers who have been driven out of the workforce because of discouragement, it's something more like 22%. The economy has lost about 11 million jobs since the beginning of the recession. Wage cuts are widespread. Benefit cuts are widespread. Union workers at least have the pretense of negotiation, often it's just a pretense. Non-union workers have had these cuts imposed upon them. The social consequences of this are enormous. 12% of people in the United States, 36 million people, rely on the government for some form of food aid. 12%. And I could go on about poverty increases and so on, but there's no time. And according to some estimates, it's going to take until another 7 or 8 years before the unemployment rate comes down to 5%, which means that the social problems created by mass unemployment will only magnify. As people, middle-aged workers at their highest earning years are thrown out of the workforce, and young workers cannot get the foothold into the workforce to start families, to advance. That's the picture, a deep crisis, and it reflects capital's program. It's not just push the immediate cost of the crisis onto workers. The aim is to carry out a deep and permanent cut in the standard of living for the U.S. working class. That's been hammered away at for 30 years. It's not a new strategy, but there's a qualitative leap forward in this strategy. And it's now being sold by Obama, a man who campaigned as someone who was going to help working class people. And there are many other broken promises we could talk about. The one that's worth noting here in Switzerland is healthcare reform. There's legislation on the table. It may or may not proceed, but Swiss comrades will be horrified to learn that the model for the U.S. plan is the Swiss model, but much worse, much more expensive in terms of the costs that are imposed on people to try and get it, if it becomes law at all. Obama has also, of course, broken promises on any number of other fronts, such as pulling back the Bush attacks on civil liberties, closing the prison in Guantanamo Bay. And, obviously, one of the biggest broken promise by Obama is, well, it's not so much a broken promise, but as people begin to realize what he was really saying in the campaign, which was the U.S. should pull back in Iraq, not out, but back to bases, and try to create a more stable client state while concentrating its effort on Afghanistan. And so now we have $30 billion, 30,000 troop surge in Afghanistan. And Obama's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech was really a kind of a war manifesto. And while Obama has repackaged U.S. imperialism, he's repackaged the Bush Doctrine, the content remains the same. The U.S. is not about to retreat from its footholds in the Middle East. It's not about to retreat from its footholds in Central Asia. On the contrary, Obama's aim is to consolidate those, rationalize Bush's excesses, and consolidate that control. In Latin America, the U.S. is pushing a hard line, as exemplified by support for the coup in Honduras, to try to push right-wing governments back into power. And the U.S. response to the Haitian earthquake really, I think, encapsulates U.S. imperialism in Latin America. Only about 10 cents of every U.S. dollar spent so far actually comes to aid for Haitians. The real operation right now is encircling Haiti with warships to make sure that people can't flee and try to come to Florida. So that's the picture of Obama, and the result has been widespread disorientation and disillusionment. In 3 minutes, I have to talk about the positive side now. Okay. But there are some. The fact that their expectations were so high has created the possibility, and actually it's evident, you can see it, of people who may have had some illusions in Obama, partial illusions, have begun to move into activity, sometimes in their unions, sometimes as student activists, sometimes in social movement struggles, to try to put together some kind of opposition to the wave of budget cuts that are coming down, for example. And while this is taking a kind of a scattered form, it's wrong to be speaking of a big rebellion on the left. It's quite important, because as people may be aware, because we have a two-party system in the United States, a liberal capitalist party and a conservative capitalist party, the Republican right is positioning itself for a comeback, because we don't have any sort of labor or social democratic party. So the Republicans, believe it or not, are getting up and denouncing Obama and the Democrats for being too close to Wall Street and for pushing a health care plan that will cut health care for elderly people, both of which are true, of course. But the Republicans are posturing without offering any coherent alternative of their own, but they don't have to, because the Democrats have become the party of the status quo. The depth of the crisis in the U.S. and it's in the long trends of social polarization that preceded it has actually created the basis for the radicalization of the working class. It's taking place in a context of political polarization. And it takes place in a context after 30 years of retreat and defeat on the part of the left. So the capacity of the unions, where the unions are willing to fight, and the social movements is still quite fragmentary. But there are examples. The struggle to defend gay marriage after an unfavorable result in California has led to a new grassroots lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movement, which with practically no resources managed to mobilize some 200,000 people for a protest in Washington recently. There have been a couple of important strike victories despite in recent months, despite the context of mass unemployment. And one of the most exciting, I think, struggles that is taking place is in the state of California, the biggest state with more than 40 million people, where the budget crisis is most intense. And it's a struggle that actually began with a rather small union of professional technical employees at the University of California who had a strike, had planned for a one-day strike. They went to the students and got support, they went to the faculty and got support, and it had a much bigger impact than they expected in a day of strike and protest in September. They've come together, they've formed a movement up and down the state of California. It's brought in other public university systems. It's brought in the local school districts, kindergarten through high school. And on the 4th of March, we're going to see in California, up and down the state, protests, demonstrations, and some strikes, and some walkouts in schools, and some factory, building occupations. This is tremendously important because there have been other struggles in the recent past which show that people will rally to something that they see as challenging the status quo. And I believe that in this environment, if the left can find a place to put its focal point, build a struggle as a fighting example, the results can be multiplied very quickly. And I'll leave the last word to the great people's historian Howard Zinn, who passed away earlier this week. Howard was a long-time socialist. He died at the age of 87. Wrote a book which is, if you're interested in U.S. history, you should read, called The People's History of the United States. And Howard was somebody, despite being a bombardier in the Second World War, and through all the ups and downs of the struggles, always remained forward-looking and an optimist. And what he said about the Democrats in office is something that the left in the U.S. has to take to heart and build upon. He said this: the really critical thing isn't who is sitting in the White House, but who is sitting in the streets, in the cafeterias, in the halls of government, in the factories. Who is protesting, who is occupying offices and demonstrating. Those are the things that determine what happens. Thanks.